Welcome to our study in Minor Prophets as we focus on the book of Micah. And this is actually part 2 in our study. Last class, one of the things that we focused on was the authorship and the background of the book. As we mentioned, Micah, as you can see in the superscription of chapter 1, verse 1, it says that Micah was from Moresheth. And Moresheth was a city of about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And we know that he was actually the prophet during the time of three different kings: Jotham, Hezekiah, and Ahaz. And it's guessed that the book was possibly written around 722 BC. And one of the things that we also focused on Micah was how Micah, one of the main places he was actually mentioned himself, was, of course, in the book of Jeremiah, who, of course, is another prophet, found in Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 17 through 19. After that, we then, of course, went through the text, and as we looked through the text, one of the things that I mentioned to you was that the focus of the book was really to two different groups: Judah and Israel. And it was, of course, focused mainly, of course, towards the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, not just one or the other, like many of the other prophets are. And so, as we went through the study, one of the things I decided to do was to kind of divide it into two parts. And the two parts were pretty similar. The first part, it was one of the, I guess the way we introduced it was first as a judgment oracle. And the way Micah puts it, and he does this in the second part as well, he introduces himself almost as a lawyer and then puts God on trial. Well, in the second part, he of course is the lawyer again, but he decides to, not put God on trial, but to call God to the witness stand. In the second part, he actually calls all of creation to the witness stand. And after he gives in both parts the warnings and judgments, he then gives these salvation oracles. And of course, within those is each and every sign of hope that he gives them. And it's neat. The first sign of hope, as we looked at in the first section, was described as when he's describing the sins of the people. He then talks about how when things are restored how they ought to be, God and his temple will be elevated, and people will so be involved in his worship that they will be streaming down from that point. And as we looked at in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, and chapter 5, verses 5 through 15, those that elevate the temple and are part of that worship will, in fact, be able to be living in peace, but will also prosper. Of course, then we looked at the second part of this as the second round of judgment, and again, it's another legal dispute. And the legal dispute is over the fact that they are not taking part in the covenant as they were called to do. But again, after the announcing of the fact that they haven't taken care of things like they should, he then tells them what they should be doing. And one of the contrasts, he says, it's not about just offering your burnt offerings and sacrifices, but the thing that I want is justice, mercy, and humility. And again, the book ends the same way as the other one does, with the picture of not just of peace, but salvation, and that God's people will be able to experience this salvation after that judgment ends. And so what I want to do today, of course, as I mentioned in the second video, as we introduced the first video, the first thing I wanted to do, of course, was to describe the connection between this book and the New Testament. And there are two main connections. Then after that, what we're going to do after we look at those connections, we'll then look at an area that Micah really focused on, that we can also see in the Gospels. And then I'll give you the review for the midterm test. And so let's focus on the connections between Micah's account and the Gospel. And one of the things that I guess is a way to put it, it seems as if like Micah is definitely anticipating the Gospel. And the words that Micah is giving to the people are words that, whether those at the time realize it or not, were going to resonate several years down the road. And so let's turn first to Micah chapter 5. Micah chapter 5, if you'll flip there with me for a second. And as I've mentioned to you before, we've been looking primarily from my account, which is an English Standard Version. And beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from whom you shall come forth for me, one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Now, I don't know if your description says this at the top, but mine, again in the ESV, it says the ruler to be born in Bethlehem. Now, if you look, of course, in chapter 2, it does, of course, mention Bethlehem. Now, here's what my commentary has to say on it. It says, both here and in chapter 4, verse 8, these words signal a renewed kingship. And if you look down, it says the unlikely choice of David as king foreshadows the unlikely choice of Bethlehem as the hometown of the greater David. Again, as we had mentioned before with the town of Bethlehem, Bethlehem is not a city that a lot of people were drawn to. It was not a big city at all, and honestly, it was kind of the filth of a town. And so it's not anything that you would definitely think the Messiah would come from. But look at the connection here. Then if you look in verse 4, it says, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty and the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for he shall be great to the ends of the earth. And one of the common analogies that, of course, you see Jesus being described as, especially in the lost chapter, Luke 15, not lost, obviously, because it hasn't been found, but lost because it focuses on the three different lost things, and one of those being a sheep. And you think about if, as the text describes, if Jesus had 100 sheep, but he lost one, he would leave the 99 to go find that one lost sheep. Again, he's being described there as the shepherd. And he is so often throughout the Gospels. And so I want us to flip over to the book of Matthew to show the tie-in here between the two texts. If you'll flip over to the book of Matthew. All right, Matthew chapter 2 is where we'll be, and we're going to be reading verses 5 and 6. It says, they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, of course, as I mentioned in verse 6, this is where this is coming from, and this is taking a course from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Now, this is also seen in 2 Samuel. If you'll flip over to the book of 2 Samuel as well, you can see this quotation how alludes to a shepherd theme. You know, of course, that was something that was like who? David. And again, these people were looking for a David-like figure, and here is that shepherd analogy. So flip over to the book of 2 Samuel. And we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. It says in verse 1, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be a prince over Israel. And so you can see here the connection between Micah 5, 2 Samuel 5, and of course Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. This theme of a shepherd to come, and one to be a shepherd over a flock. And again, remembering the tie between David and of course Jesus Christ. Now flip over to Micah chapter 4, and we're going to look at the next connection. Micah chapter 4. And let's read together verses 1 through 3. It says, and it shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established at the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and the peoples will flow from it. And many nations shall come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall come between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. The nation shall lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. I hope you can see the type of picture that Micah is planning here. Again, it's that picture as described when, as you look at that first, I guess you could say, wave of judgment. Right after they got past that, here's the salvation piece and the time of peaceful messages and encouragement and prosperity. One of the things that he is, of course, talking about again is elevating God to that mountain. But one of the things that you notice is that he's talking about here, it says, not only will the people worship there, but there will be peace and there will be no war. And this is one of the things that it mentions is kind of in this idea of being in the last days. And so another New Testament connection is not just the birth of a Messiah, but also the birth of a new kingdom. And you can see this kingdom language, of course, in verse 4. I mean, excuse me, verse 3, when it says a sword against a nation, they won't learn any war. And you can hear the parts of the nations with the people. And it says, and shall decide for strong nations far away, and beat their swords into plowshares. And so the two New Testament connections that we see here in the book of Micah, of course, the birth of a Messiah, but also the birth of a kingdom. And so moving on now from those connections, those two connections, I now want to focus a little bit before we get into the review. I want to look in Micah chapter 6. You'll flip with me there, Micah chapter 6. And I want to read verses 6 through 8. And again, I'm not always selling into headings, but sometimes I think they're good, especially in an introduction class such as this one. It says, above verse 6, it says, what does the Lord require? And I guess we could say these things are definitely at the heart of Micah's message, at some things he requires. Look at the first thing. It says, with what shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Again, this is that whole idea we mentioned before, that he's saying, listen, I'm wanting you to get past just the burnt offerings, just the sacrifices. And then he begins to get into what the Lord has required and what will please him. He says, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? I want to focus on those three things for just a moment and to see those in a connection, especially with themes that were produced in the New Testament. Justice, kindness, and humility. Flip with me to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. All right, Matthew 22. And let's look at verses 37 through 40. Keeping again that whole idea of justice, kindness, and humility. Matthew 22, 37 through 40. It says, and he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest commandment. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. This is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Now, staying in that same area, if you flip just one chapter over, and it is interesting that this section is seven woes to the scribes and the Pharisees, because one of the common themes we've seen throughout the prophets is different woes or different warnings. The first one is this. In verse 23, where one of them, it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier matters. And here's the weightier matters, he said, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. This was part of the mighty struggle of Jesus, is the fact that he kept trying to get people over and over again to get the message of what he was trying to preach and what he was trying to teach. He said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. And part of that was to bring about his new kingdom, and a part of that was grace. They could not stand the fact of grace, the fact that anybody could be a part of this kingdom. And so this is what he's saying here. He said, listen, you've done some of the things. Maybe you feel like you've dotted your I's and you've crossed your T's. He said, but the problem is you've missed the weightier matters, the justice, the mercy, and the faithfulness. Flip over to Galatians chapter 5. And this is a passage, whether you realize it or not, you're all probably familiar with. Matthew chapter 5. Let's begin in verse 22. It says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law." Verse 24 says, "And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and with its desires." Again, you see this connection in James chapter 1, verse 25. If you'll flip over there, James chapter 1, beginning in verse 25. It says, "But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious, but does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless." Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is to visit the orphans and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. And one of the things that he says here, and I love in verse 26, "If anyone thinks he's religious, but does not bridle his tongue, deceives his heart, and this person's religion is worthless." Does this sound familiar? Some of the, especially the message of Amos, that it's not just about all the outward signs, it's all about is the inward heart there. Because one of the things that Amos mentioned so many times was the fact he didn't want a just empty words of change, but he wanted true, sincere change. And so you can even see some of the qualities, as we've mentioned here today, that are tied in between these two, between, of course, things mentioned in Matthew, James, and Galatians, also in Micah as well. All right, so it's time for our review. And of course, this will definitely be a good time to get out your pen and paper as we go through this. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, and the good news is, of course, since we have these videos up on YouTube, you're able to watch them again and again. So let's start from Micah. Micah means who is like Yahweh. Micah means who is like Yahweh. According to the prophet Micah, God wanted these three qualities instead of their offerings: justice, kindness, and humility. What Micah focuses on that God wanted more than their offerings was justice, kindness, and humility. Micah of Moresheth is also mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. Micah of Moresheth is also mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. The prophet of Micah also shows the connection between what two births? The two births were the birth of the Messiah and the birth of the kingdom. Number 5, the next thing I want to look at is Jonah. Jonah was a book that was likely composed after the fall of what? Nineveh. After the fall of Nineveh. Going back to Jonah again, Jonah's name means dove. According to Genesis 26 and 27, Jacob and Esau were the ones that were constantly quarreling. Next, Edom stands for the descendants of Esau. Edom stands for the descendants of Esau. The shortest book in the Old Testament is Obadiah. Hosea's name means salvation. Hosea's marriage depicts a relationship with Israel. I want you to think about the three main characters and key figures in the book of Hosea, and those are Hosea, Gomer, and Jezreel. Prophets are human messengers. Prophets are human messengers sent by God to reveal His will. The name Joel means Yahweh is God. Joel may have been also not just a prophet, but a priest. Joel might have not just been a prophet, but a priest. Joel's prophetic works come on the heels of a very devastating locust plague. Now let's look at Amos. Amos is from a place called Tekoa. Tekoa. The name Amos means burden bearer. The next review I want to look at is Amos's prophetic work was done during the reign of Jeroboam II. And keep in mind that a prophetic message always began with this phrase, "Thus says the Lord." That is the end of our second video, and I hope you do well on the test. and are continuing to enjoy in the discussion boards and the other assignments. Have a great day.